Hello and welcome to Eros and Exegesis. My name is Evan Francis Murray, and this is the actual part one. Last episode was the introduction. That's why it's titled Introduction, but yet when I started talking yesterday, I said part one, and I just want to make the parts actually about the confrontations, and I grouped those into 8 groups. So today we're basically going to cover the confrontation with a little bit of mind and time today. So part 1 is actually about Descartes, the subject as spectator and the world as picture. So I'm going to start off with a parable here, and I want you to imagine standing in a room, looking through a window at the world outside. The glass is perfectly transparent. You see the trees, the sky, the buildings beyond. But here is the peculiar thing. You are aware that simultaneously, of the glass itself, you know that what you see is mediated. Okay, so, you look out the window, you see these buildings, you become aware of the glass that you're looking through, and you're like, oh, okay, this is mediated. That the world reaches you only through this pane, not the PAIN type. Everything you perceive has already passed through a medium that shapes and frames your world. So now imagine that you begin to doubt whether the glass is truly transparent. Like maybe this is a filtration system. Perhaps it's tinted. Perhaps it's warped. Perhaps this glass distorts everything that passes through it. And then in a stroke of absolute radical doubt, you realize that the only thing you can be absolutely certain of is the fact that you are looking. The world might actually be an illusion. The glass might be the first layer of a deception. But the act of seeing, the thinking that thinks, the cogito, at least this, is indubitable, without a doubt. Heidegger gave this framing a name, the world picture, the Weltbild. For the modern age, he argued, the world does not simply exist, it is represented, set over against a subject, framing and mastered as an image. Descartes was the first to draw that frame with metaphysical precision. And yet, there's an irony here. That transparent window that gives Descartes his metaphor is, in its very transparency, far closer to Heidegger's hammer than to Descartes' own theory of representation. The window in use withdraws. We look through it, not at it. Descartes, by beginning with doubt, forces us to stare at the glass. And that shift from living through the world to inspecting it as an object for a subject, this marks for Heidegger the original catastrophe. This, in a manner that would shape the entire subsequent history of Western philosophy, is René Descartes' starting point. And it is also for Heidegger the starting point of the crisis. In Being in Time and throughout his career, Heidegger confronted Descartes with a ferocity that can only be explained by the depth of the stake involved. For Heidegger, Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, was not merely an epistemological move, but an ontological catastrophe. It split reality into 2 fundamentally different kinds of substance. Res cognitans, the thinking thing, and res extensa, the extended thing. mind and matter, subject and object, the thinking self, enclosed in its own certainty, gazes out at a world of dead, mechanical objects that are fundamentally alien to it. This split, what philosophers call the subject-object dualism, became for Heidegger the hidden architecture of modern thought. Every subsequent philosophy, however different its conclusions, operated within the space that Descartes had opened. The problem of knowledge became the problem of how a subject can come to know an object. The problem of the external world became the problem of how the mind can be certain of a reality that exists independently of it. And the problem of meaning became the problem of how subjective representations can correspond to objective facts. As the philosopher Hubert Dreyfus argued in his classic commentary, Being in the World, Descartes' legacy is not merely a theory, but a way of experiencing, a mode of being in which we are perpetually alienated from the world that we inhabit. Heidegger's counter movement is one of the most radical in the history of philosophy. He does not try to bridge the gap between subject and object, between mind and world. He denies that the gap exists in the first place. We are not, Heidegger argues, subjects who happen to be in a world, as if the world were a container and we were items placed inside of it. We are being in the world, in der Weltsein. And this hyphenated being is not a contingent arrangement, but the fundamental structure of our own existence. We do not first exist as isolated consciousnesses and then encounter the world. We are always already thrown into a world of meanings, practices, and concerns that we did not create and cannot fully master. Consider the difference between Descartes' gaze and Heidegger's hammer. For Descartes, the paradigmatic encounter with the world is the act of looking, of representing the world to oneself in clear and distinct ideas. For Heidegger, the paradigmatic encounter is the act of using, of reaching for a hammer, grasping it, driving the nail. When the hammer works well, we do not think about it at all. It withdraws into the background of our practical engagement, becoming what Heidegger calls Zuhandenheit, ready to hand. Only when the hammer breaks, when the head flies off or the handle cracks, does it suddenly become Vorhandenheit, present at hand, an object of theoretical contemplation. Descartes' entire philosophy, Heidegger suggests, is the philosophy of the broken hammer, and what it can never recover is the seamless, practical engagement that precedes it. The mode of being Heidegger calls circumspection. Circumspection is this kind of sight that knows where the hammer is without staring at it, that navigates a workshop without a map. Descartes, by being with doubt, begins with blindness to this whole dimension. So, what did Heidegger collect from Descartes? 3 things. First, the recognition that modern philosophy is built on a split, something we can call a wound that is never healed. Second, the strategic insight that the problem of knowledge is not a puzzle to be solved, but a symptom of a deeper forgetting. And third, this is the Bloomian term, the figure of the shadow father himself. Descartes is the strong poet whose strength is so overwhelming that every subsequent thinker must either submit to his terms or swerve from them. And I want to invoke the language of Harold Bloom here to show how, literary criticism and philosophical criticism, these terminologies that can add so much depth to the performance of what's happening here, that not my performance, but the performance of what we're learning, what we're engaging with. In the language of Harold Bloom, Heidegger performed a profound clinamen, a creative misprision. That's like a misreading of Descartes that swerved away from his predecessors. But in Heidegger's own terms, however, this intervention is recognized as the necessary violence of destruction. His target was not merely to refute Descartes, but to completely invert the Cartesian foundation, where Descartes anchored certainty into the enclosed theater of the isolated subject. Heidegger excavated a deeper stratum, grounding the very possibility of meaning in a primordial, worldly engagement that precedes the subject-object split entirely. Heidegger incorporated the Cartesian diagnosis into Being and Time as the opening move of his Division 1 of that book. The analysis of Dasein begins not with consciousness, not with the ego, not with the subject, but with being in the world as a unitary phenomenon, being through the world, with the world, like you're a product of the world, like your arm is a part of your body per se. The worldhood of the world, the who of Dasein, the modes of being in. These are not separate topics to be treated sequentially, but aspects of a single structure that can only be separated by an act of philosophical abstraction. And this abstraction, Heidegger argues, is not merely an intellectual error. It is a way of being, the way of being of a culture that has lost touch with the practical engagement that constitutes its most fundamental relation to reality. The takeaway from Descartes, then, is this: the subject-object split is not a philosophical discovery, but a philosophical invention. And it is an invention that has shaped the entire trajectory of modern thought by concealing the more original unity of being in the world. Every thinker Heidegger subsequently engaged would be read implicitly or explicitly against this Cartesian background, but none more intimately than the man who taught him phenomenology itself. Because if Descartes is that Bloomian terminology of shadow father, as we're talking about, of modern philosophy, then Edmund Husserl is the immediate father, the ones whose tools Heidegger would take up and turn them against their maker. And this has brought us now into the second part of this 3-section lecture of part 2. Of part 1, excuse me. Of part 1, that's right. It's still part 1. This is the second section. And this is going to be about Husserl, the mentor, the method, and the rebellion. So just like the lecture about Descartes, I want to kind of bring you in through your imagination here. And I want you to imagine an inheritance, but it's not money or property. It's something far more precious and far more dangerous. It's a method for seeing the world. Your teacher has spent a lifetime developing a method, a way of looking at the quality of existence, a technique for stripping away the assumptions, for returning to the things themselves, for seeing what is actually there rather than what you expect to find. And then, having learned this method, you turn it against your teacher's own assumptions. You use his own tools to dismantle his own conclusions. You show that the very thing he thought he had bracketed and confined, his own way of being in the world, was the one thing he had never truly examined. This is the story of Heidegger's relationship with Edmund Husserl, a relationship that was at once the most consequential philosophical mentorship of the 20th century and the most devastating philosophical rebellion. If Descartes was the shadow father, the distant specter whose legacy haunted modernity from across the centuries, then definitely Husserl was the living precursor. He was not a monument to be circumvented in imagination. He was a breathing, teaching, judging presence, a father still occupying the chair that the son coveted. Heidegger could not simply swerve around him in the privacy of thought. He had to climb over him in real time, in shared offices, in public lectures, in the very faculty of philosophy at Freiburg. Husserl was the founder of phenomenology. And phenomenology, as Husserl conceived it, was a method for describing experience as it is actually lived prior to all theoretical abstractions. The rallying cry of phenomenology was "Zu dann Sachen selbst." Now, this is, again, German. I shouldn't even be attempting that because obviously, if you have any kind of German background, you're probably laughing right now, and that's fine. But this was to the things themselves. And this cry would become, in Heidegger's hands, something far more radical than Husserl himself had intended. To understand what Heidegger took from Husserl and what he turned against, we must begin with the epoch, that strange and difficult operation that stands at the center of Husserl's method. The epoch is a suspension of what Husserl called the natural attitude, that everyday stance in which we simply take for granted that the world exists independently of our experience of it. When you walk down the street, you do not question whether the buildings you see are really there. You assume a straightforward existence of things. Husserl asked us to put this assumption out of play, not to deny the world's existence, but to bracket it, to set it aside so we can examine something else. What remains after this bracketing is what Husserl called the phenomenological residuum, not the world itself, but the world as it appears to consciousness, the intentional object as it is constituted within the field of awareness. Here, Husserl uncovered the noetic, nomatic structure, the correlation between the act of experiencing and the object as experienced, between the perceiving and the perceived as perceived. For Husserl, this structure belonged fundamentally to consciousness. The noesis is the act of seeing. The noema is the building as seen, the object precisely as it is given in this particular glance. Every consciousness, Husserl showed, is consciousness of something, And this directedness toward objects is not accidental, but essential. Heidegger accepted this method with a depth of commitment that few students ever bring to their teacher's work. But he saw something in Husserl's method that Husserl himself had not fully grasped. Something hidden in the early masterwork that predated the transcendental turn. As Heidegger himself would later recount in his essay, My Way to Phenomenology, the decisive text was not the ideas with its transcendental ego, but the logical investigations. And within that work, the sixth investigation, with its distinction between sensuous intuition and categorical intuition. Sensuous intuition gives us individual things, the red of this apple, the hardness of this table. But categorical intuition gives us something else entirely. It gives us being, the isness, the thatness, the whatness of things. When I say that the chair is brown, I see the brown and I see the chair. But where is the is? I do not see the is with my eyes. It is not a color or a shape or a texture. Yet it is the most real thing about the encounter. This isness is not an idea I add later in judgment. It is given to me in the very look of things, categorically intuited. As Heidegger once said, this distinction revealed to him the question of being in an entirely new light. Here was a way to encounter being directly, in intuition, not as an abstract concept, but as something given in the very act of understanding. This was the bridge that would carry Heidegger from phenomenology to ontology, from the study of consciousness to the question of being itself. Connected to this discovery was Husserl's concept of Erfüllung. Again, it's another German word, but it means basically fulfillment. For Husserl, intentionality is not merely an empty directedness. It is fulfilled in intuition. When you expect to see a friend and then actually see them, your empty intention is filled by the intuitive presence of the thing itself. Truth for Husserl is precisely this fulfillment, this coincidence between what is meant and what is given. Heidegger would take this concept and transform it into something far more primordial. Where Husserl spoke of truth as the adequation of intention and intuition, Heidegger would come to speak of truth as aletheia, as unconcealment, as the event by which beings emerge from hiddenness into the open. The seed of this transformation lives in the categorical intuition and the fulfillment structure of the logical investigations. Heidegger saw that if being can be intuited and if truth is fulfillment, then truth is not merely a property of propositions, but an event in which beings disclose themselves. This was the treasure he extracted from Husserl's early work, the resource more radical than its author recognized. But here is where the rebellion begins. Having found in the logical investigations the tools for an ontological breakthrough, Heidegger confronted the later Husserl, the Husserl of the transcendental ego. For the later Husserl, the epoch revealed not merely the structures of experience, but a pure, detached consciousness standing behind all particular experiences, the transcendental ego that constitutes all meaning. Heidegger's rebellion against this move was quiet but devastating. He argued that the transcendental ego was not simply a Cartesian subject dressed in phenomenological clothing. It was something more subtle and therefore more dangerous. Husserl had performed a radical reduction, yet he had fallen back into the subject-object schema by making the purified ego the absolute ground of all constitution. The epoch, which was meant to return us to the things themselves, had instead severed consciousness from the world by bracketing the natural attitude. Husserl had bracketed the very thing he should have examined most closely: our practical, engaged, finite being in the world. Heidegger realized that when you bracket the world, you are not left with a pure mind, you are left with a void. For Heidegger, the only way to see Dasein is to see it in the thick of things, to see it hammering, driving, worrying, being there. He did not want to suspend the natural attitude. He wanted to show that the natural attitude is the only place truth actually happens. Now, I want you to recall the hammer from our introduction and our discussion of Descartes. Husserl wanted to bracket the hammer in order to study the consciousness that perceives it. Heidegger wanted to watch the hand that grasps it, the arm that swings it, the concern that chooses it. The noetic nomadic structure, which for Husserl described the correlation of consciousness and object, Heidegger would transform into the structure of meaningful involvement. The way Dasein is already entangled with the things it uses, the people it encounters, the world it cannot step outside of. The philosopher Robert Sokolowski, in his careful study of this relationship, has observed that Heidegger's reading of Husserl was that what Harold Bloom would call a misprision, a creative misreading that took Husserl's method in a direction Husserl never intended. But Sokolowski also shows us something more important, that this misreading, it was not arbitrary. It was made necessary by the internal tensions of phenomenology itself. Where Husserl wanted to describe the structures of consciousness as a detached, transcendental field, Heidegger wanted to describe the structures of existence. Where Husserl bracketed the world in order to focus on the ego, Heidegger insisted that the self could only be understood through its immersion in the world. Where Husserl sought a universal, transcendental foundation for all knowledge, Heidegger sought the factical ground of being, the concrete, historical, finite way in which we find ourselves thrown into a world of meanings we did not create and cannot fully master. The reduction for Heidegger was not a turning away from the world, but a reduction to the world, a return to the density of factical life. The decisive move came in being in time. Heidegger took Husserl's concept of intentionality, this directedness of consciousness toward objects, and radicalized it into the concept of care. For Husserl, intentionality meant that consciousness is always of something. To perceive is to perceive something. To think is to think about something. For Heidegger, this directedness was not merely a feature of consciousness, but the fundamental structure of being itself. Dasein is not a subject that stands over against objects. Dasein is care, and a being whose very existence is constituted by its concern for its own being and for the beings it encounters in the world. The world is not a collection of objects arrayed before a detached gaze. It is a network of involvements, a field of practical significances, the place where we already are at work before we ever begin to theorize. And I just want to mention, Heidegger's care, which is Mitsein. It's not a care as in care about your grandma or your dog. It's more like a care about oh, what are you doing? Or what's happening over there? Or, did you finish the project? Like that kind of care. I don't think it's a human empathy as much as it's like an inquiry of care, care about being inquisitive or what the answer might be. Now, regarding care, care for what we're talking about, there's a crucial institutional detail that must not be overlooked. In 1928, Heidegger edited and published Husserl's lectures on the phenomenology of internal time consciousness. This was not incidental editorial labor. It is one of history's great ironies. Husserl handed Heidegger the keys to the clock, the lectures in which he had analyzed how consciousness constitutes time itself through the interplay of retention, primal impression, and protension. And Heidegger used them to dismantle the very idea of a timeless transcendental subject. He took Husserl's retention and protension and transformed them into thrownness and anticipation, the temporal heartbeat of a finite, dying being. Where Husserl had described time as the self-constitution of transcendental consciousness, Heidegger described time as the horizon of being, the condition of possibility for Dasein's understanding of its own existence. The lectures on time consciousness were the last gift Husserl gave his student, and Heidegger transformed them into the temporal ontology that would overturn the entire metaphysical tradition. What did Heidegger collect from Husserl? He collected the phenomenological method, that unwavering commitment to describing experience as it is lived, that refusal to substitute theoretical abstractions for concrete description, that demand that philosophy return to the things themselves. He collected the concept of intentionality and the directedness of consciousness toward the world, and he saw that this directedness was not confined to cognition, but permeated every aspect of existence. He collected the courage to break with the entire tradition of Western metaphysics by starting from experience rather than from abstract principle. And most importantly, he collected the discovery of categorical intuition and fulfillment, the recognition that being and truth can be encountered directly in the intuitive encounter with the world. But Heidegger also performed a Bloomian clinamen, a swerve that transformed everything Husserl had built. By replacing the transcendental ego with Dasein, by replacing the study of consciousness with the analysis of being in the world, by replacing the quest for transcendental foundations with the investigation of finite historical existence, Heidegger did not merely extend phenomenology. He overturned it from within, using Husserl's own method to reach conclusions that Husserl himself found unacceptable. Consider the famous dedication of Being and Time to Edmund Husserl in Friendship and Admiration. In the language of Harold Bloom, this dedication was Heidegger's tessera, a token of recognition that simultaneously announced his departure. He was saying, I am your heir, but to inherit your kingdom, I must burn it down. It was, in retrospect, a farewell, as much as a tribute. The student had taken the master's tools and built a house that the master could not enter. The takeaway from Husserl, then, is this. Phenomenology's commitment to describing lived experience contained resources far more radical than its founder recognized. By radicalizing phenomenology against its own transcendental assumptions, by discovering ontology in the categorical intuition and truth in the event of unconcealment, Heidegger transformed phenomenology from a method for studying consciousness into a method for interrogating being itself. And having learned this lesson from Husserl, Heidegger would now turn to a thinker who had pursued the question of time along an entirely different path, not through the analysis of consciousness, but through the intuition of duration, the fluid, indivisible flow of lived time. That thinker was Henri, or in French, Henri Bergson, who had already discovered that the self is not a thing, but a duration, a continuous melody in which past and present interpenetrate. Where Husserl gave Heidegger the architecture of temporal consciousness, Bergson would offer him the image of time as creative becoming, the river that no clock can measure. It is to Bergson that we now turn. And here we are in the third part of part one, Bergson. And I'm going to use the English pronunciation of his name. He was French, so that would be like Henri Bergson. But I will be anglicizing that to Henri Bergson, just to keep it simple for me. Just like I am skipping over a lot of German words that Heidegger uses. I try to use the ones that are very central in his philosophy, but mostly I'm just anglicizing everything because I'm English. And if you're listening to me, you're probably English too. All right, so duration and the ghost of spatialized time. Let's start this off with a question. Do you think you could catch a river in a net? Not a fish in the river, not the objects that float upon its surface, but do you think you could catch the river itself, its flow, its movement, the way it is always the same river and yet never the same river? The way that it carries everything along without ever being carried itself? You can cast your net, you can pull it up, and what are you going to find? Well, you'll probably find a mesh full of water that is no longer flowing. No longer flowing a river at all. And you're going to find merely a collection of drops that have lost the very thing that made them a river. Their movement, their duration, their life. This image captures something essential about Henri Bergson's philosophy of time and about why Heidegger, despite sharing Bergson's fundamental intuition, nevertheless rejected Bergson's solution with a ferocity that puzzles many readers. Bergson was, in many ways, Heidegger's most important precursor on the question of temporality. Where most philosophers had treated time as a spatial quantity, a sequence of discrete moments arranged like beads on a string, Bergson argued that real time is something entirely different. Real time, which Bergson called gire or duration, is a continuous qualitative flow in which past, present, and future interpenetrate without ever being separable. Duration is not something we measure with clocks. It is something we live, something we are. And here's the sting of Heidegger's critique. Bergson, for all his brilliance, was still trying to catch the river in a net. He called the net duration. He insisted it wasn't a net at all, but the water itself. Yet by naming it, by opposing it to space, he had already pulled it from the flow and laid it out for inspection. He gave us a better picture of time, but Heidegger wanted to step outside the frame entirely. This is the world picture problem, reappearing in a new key, the problem we traced in Descartes, where representing the world to a subject already distorts what it seeks to capture. Bergson's duration, for all its fluidity, remains a representation of time that, in Heidegger's view, never quite reaches time itself. Heidegger's confrontation with Bergson is concentrated in a single devastating footnote in Being and Time, a footnote that has generated maybe more scholarly commentary than many entire chapters. In this note, Heidegger acknowledges Bergson's achievement. Bergson was the first modern philosopher to take seriously and challenge the Aristotelian definition of time, and to recognize that the vulgar concept of time, that's the time as sequence of now points, this view of time is fundamentally inadequate to the phenomenon of temporal experience. But then, in a move that is characteristic of Heidegger's agon, his grappling, his wrestling with these ideas with his predecessors, Heidegger delivers his verdict. Let me read you the heart of this. So, in Being and Time, I'm going to quote it here. Bergson's conception of duration is not drawn from the phenomenon of time itself, but arises from a misinterpretation of Aristotle's concept of time. It is an attempt to grasp time by starting from space, though Bergson thinks he is doing the opposite, end quote. Now, this is devastating. I mean, it's a devastating move on Heidegger's part. Heidegger is not simply disagreeing with Bergson. He's claiming that Bergson's great achievement, liberating time from space, was itself spatialized at root. Bergson fought against the clock, against the slicing of life into static measurable units. But the weapon he chose, the concept of a pure flowing duration, it was forged in the very spatial metaphors he sought to overcome. As the philosopher Francois Julian had argued in his comparative studies of Chinese and Western thought, Bergson's effort to liberate time from space paradoxically reinforced that spatialization it sought to overcome. The river may flow, but a flow is still something that moves through space. The escape from spatial image led straight into another. This is the first intersection, the trap of spatialized time. Bergson fought against clock time, against the slicing of life into static, measurable units. He proposed duration as a continuous, qualitative flow. And yet, because he defined this duration against space rather than the ground up, he remained trapped in what Heidegger called the vulgar concept of time, the very concept he was trying to escape. Heidegger's own project was more radical, not to oppose spatialized time with non-spatial alternative, but to show that both the vulgar concept and its Bergsonian alternative are derivative of a more primordial temporality, the temporality of Dasein itself. And this is where we arrive at the second intersection, the fault line of life. This concerns what we might call lived time and its connection to practical engagement. As the philosopher Mark Okrand and others have noted, Bergson's duration has a remarkable affinity with Heidegger's concept of Zuhandenheit. Do you remember this from the introduction? If you weren't with us, it's okay, because we're going to kind of dive into this here. So Zuhandenheit, that's the readiness to hand. When you use a hammer, you do not look at a clock. You exist in a seamless, fluid web of action where the past, your skill, the present, the hammering, and the future, whatever you're building, like the finished table or, chair, whatever it is, they all merge into this single task. And when we look at this Zuhandenheit, this Heideggerian, fluid of web action, this is highly Bergsonian, a kind of practical duration in which the moments are not experienced as discrete now points, but as a unified flow. But here's the divergence, and this is decisive. And the fault line opens between two entirely different ways of understanding life itself. Bergson attributes this fluid awareness to biological intuition, the élan vital, or the élan vital, the creative life force that drives all evolution. For Bergson, the seamless flow of practical action is a manifestation of life's own creative push, the same force that drives the evolution of species and the unfolding of the cosmos. Heidegger, by contrast, anchors it in existential meaning. For Heidegger, the hammer makes sense not because of a vital life force, but because of your projects, your social world, your practical concerns, the network of significations within which the hammer finds its place. Life is not a biological force, but a structure of care. And if you remember, I kind of broke this open with about what care is. It doesn't mean, again, caring about your grandma. It's like caring about getting something done, caring about what's happening. And so this difference, from Bergson, where he sees life as élan versus, as Sorg, which is Heidegger's Sorg, that care, these two, the differences between these two, the Bergson élan vital, and Heidegger Sorg, there's no bridge here. This is unbridgeable. So this brings us to the third intersection, the reversal of the current. And the third intersection concerns the very direction of temporal flow. So Bergson's duration moves from the past to the present. The past accumulates like a rolling snowball, pushing you into a creative, ever-present, the new present kind of thing. Memory, mémoire pure memory is the driving force, the reservoir, from which all present experience draws its color and its depth. The past is not gone, it is conserved, it endures. It presses forward into the new now with all the weight of everything that it has ever been. Heidegger's temporality moves in precisely the opposite direction. For Heidegger, the future is primary. Human existence is driven by anticipation, by the projection of ourselves into possibilities that we have not realized yet. We are always already ahead of ourselves, running toward our possibilities. And this futural orientation is what gives our present its meaning and our past its relevance. The future is the primary axis of time because we are constantly running toward our ultimate limit, death. This reversal from past-driven duration to future-driven existential temporality is one of the most consequential moves in Heidegger's entire philosophy. Heidegger took Bergson's living, flowing current and turned it inside out. Time does not push from behind. Heidegger argues, rather, our future pull is what gives our present action its reality. And this means that the most authentic experience of time is not the nostalgic recollection of the past, but it is the resolute anticipation of your own death, the owning up to our own finitude that gives our existence its urgency and its meaning. Bergson's snowball rolling forward and gathering the past becomes in Heidegger's hands an arrow flying toward a future that has not yet been and may never be. And this is where we're going to talk about a writer, that came after Being in Time, which was another French writer, Jean-Paul Sartre, or Sartre. In his Being in Nothingness, Sartre attempted a kind of synthesis, a fusion of differentials, as the mathematicians would say, between Bergson's duration and Heidegger's existential temporality. Sartre accepted Heidegger's futural orientation, but tried to ground it in Bergsonian consciousness, in the pour soi, the for itself, as a kind of conscious duration that is always projecting itself beyond itself. But Sartre's attempt failed, and it failed for a reason that illuminates the deepest difference between Bergson and Heidegger. For Sartre, as for Bergson, temporality remained a feature of consciousness, of the mind's way of experiencing itself. For Heidegger, temporality is not a feature of consciousness, but the ontological structure of being itself. We do not have time. We are time. We are temporal beings. This is a difference that no synthesis can bridge. All right, so what did Heidegger collect from Bergson then? We'd have to say the fundamental intuition that time is not a spatial quantity, but a lived phenomenon, a flow of duration that cannot be captured by the clock or by the calendar. The recognition that the vulgar concept of time, that's the time as a sequence of now points, that's the Aristotelian way of thinking, that is a derivative of a more primordial experience. So the critical target here, a philosopher who came closer than anyone to primordial phenomenon, but who at the decisive moment swerved back into the spatial metaphors he was trying to escape. Bergson did perform a clinamen, a creative swerve away from clock time, but Heidegger caught him and judged it incomplete. The swerve from spatialized time had not swerved far enough. It had replaced one spatial image with another, and in doing so, it had left the deeper question untouched. Not what is time, if not space, but what is the being who lives time, and what does it mean for that being to be temporal all the way down? Heidegger also diagnosed that Bergson could not see, that duration, however fluid, is still a concept of time that belongs to the present at hand, a concept that can be thought but not lived. The primordial temporality of Dasein is not duration but care. The threefold structure of thrownness, projection, and fallenness that constitute our being as a being toward the future. And this structure is not a philosophical discovery, but an ontological reality. It's the way we are. We're always projecting into the future. We're always thinking about what we want, what we're going to be, what we're going to do. And this is the way we are, whether we think about it or not. The takeaway from Bergson, then, is this. The attempt to liberate time from spatialization by opposing duration to space fails because opposition itself presupposes what it opposes. Heidegger's radical move was to show that authentic temporality is not a flow from the past to present, but it is an ecstasis towards the future, grounded in the anticipation of our own death. And it is precisely this anticipation, this beingness towards our death, being toward death, that will occupy us as we turn from the modern struggle with time to its ancient origin, to the thinker who gave Western philosophy its first and most fateful experience of truth as unconcealment, and who, in the very act of naming it, began its long transformation into mere correctness. And that is going to be Plato.